You are listening to IDEA Collider, a show that examines opportunities and challenges in pharmaceutical development, looking for inspiration for the next generation. I'm your host, Alex Gray.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of IDEA Collider. When we talk about portfolio strategy in pharma, the problem we fundamentally are trying to solve is maximizing the scientific opportunity, managing risk, and ensuring sustainable long-term value. In this episode of IDEA Collider, I'm joined by my colleague, Alex Gray, Chief Medical and Innovation Officer here at IDEA Pharma. I'm Jacqueline Poot, President, Strategic Consulting and Analytics. In today's conversation, Alex and I will explore how pharma leaders actually make trade-offs in practice and what separates good decisions from great ones. So Alex, in our 2026 Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index, now in its 15th year, we're trying to answer the question, what if you gave the same molecule to two different companies in early stage? Who would be more successful? So how much of success comes down to the decisions we make along the way rather than the molecules themselves?
No, it's a great question and one we've wrestled with for many years. I think, honestly, there's a lot of evidence from a lot of different examples of parallel development where it's very clear that the decisions that were made collectively by the asset team and then usually up the chain from that in senior management have had a very significant impact on the trajectory of the asset. I mean, some of it's about success and failure of the asset at all, but certainly how successful it's then been through clinical development and into launch. And of course, commercially afterwards, absolutely, there's plenty of evidence that is the case, with different companies having different models and approaches to what you can call decision science, how they make those decisions.
Yes, great. And I know we'll be diving into that. And there's a growing view that pharma doesn't have a science problem. It has an execution problem. So what's wrong about how organizations typically make portfolio decisions today?
Well, that's a complex question. I guess today we're largely going to focus on the bit in man and clinical development rather than the broader question back in preclinical about picking winners, as people famously call it. Absolutely. I think in terms of assets proceeding into clinical development, a lot of the modalities that we get to work on nowadays have a multiplicity of options of how we could move them forwards in development, different indications for the same molecule, and within those indications, different patient populations, different durations, different comparators, different endpoints, other things that we can alter about the profile of that asset as it moves through. And I guess it's back to that classic point that we've always made, which is that we don't launch a molecule, we launch ultimately a brand, and beneath that a label. And it's really the label that's critical. And that's not decrying, obviously, the pharmacology and the importance of the science and the clinical science, but how we proceed through can make a huge difference. And at IDEA Pharma, we're big fans of generating optionality early, really pressure testing different ways forward, so that we can understand the balance of investment, risk, rewards, each of those different options could have. And it's born of a very simple observation that if you don't have multiple choices, you've really effectively landed early on one choice, and that may be the wrong choice, and history may tell us that as we go forward.
Exactly. And you do a great job, by the way, of explaining and summarizing the complexity from going from discovery all the way through to market. And Alex, I know you've supported many pharma companies with their product and portfolio strategies, and also spend a lot of time thinking about decision frameworks to help companies make the right decision with the right information at the right time, obviously. And given all of this complexity, the scientific uncertainty, clinical risk, commercial pressure, what does a good decision framework actually need to account for? And is it going to lead then also to better portfolio outcomes? So I know you've prepared a presentation for our audience, and it would be great to dive into and start answering and unpacking this question.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me share that presentation with our listeners. There we go. Let me start with a few fundamentals and the way that we would think about this. And the first one, as this cartoon shows, is that risks to us in clinical development actually multidisciplinary, and I think this is a really crucial point. We can isolate and look at risk in these three areas, and actually I would add access and reimbursement as a fourth arm on this merry-go-round with these children. All of those things matter in our thinking as we go forward. So it's very easy, I think, particularly from the clinical development perspective, to analyze clinical risk and understand what we think is more or less likely to succeed. I'm not suggesting that's an easy process, but the risk, of course, is that there could be other facets of risk, as illustrated here, that really could ultimately drive the outcome and how successful that brand is after it's launched. And there are a multiplicity of examples of where clinical risk has been looked at adequately, but the brand has failed post-launch. And that, of course, is not where we all want to end up. So I think the most important thing we should start off with is saying at an individual asset level and then across the portfolio, we really need to consider in the round these multidisciplinary areas of risk if we're going to make the right decisions going forward. And that's not to say that most companies won't look at some of these things, but whether they actually model out systematically across those disciplines, and particularly looking for red flags, amber flags in any of these areas, because you could have green flags across a lot of this, but literally one red flag can absolutely kill your idea going forward. So it's very important to consider all of those issues. The other thing is that we're all very familiar with this. Some companies are better, worse, preventing this kind of siloing across the life cycle of the product. But obviously a decision that you make early, and that could even be preclinical actually, in terms of what you've studied and thrown over the fence into early clinical development. But certainly in the arena, we're typically more involved with the process of moving from early phase to late phase. You're making decisions early. I mean, good example is in oncology, where phase 1 work is starting to drive directionality for tumor types, patient populations, critically nowadays biomarker stratification. If we're handing something across even into phase 2 in oncology, we've already made some decisions about where we're going with that asset. And if we haven't considered that multiplicity of risk factors, as I've had on the previous slide, we may already have started to make the wrong decisions about where to go, or narrowed the field in a way that would be unhelpful and may cause problems for late phase development risk. And then ultimately, as we go to the right, the chance of success to get to market and to thrive on market as well.
So Alex, sorry to interrupt, but I'm thinking of biotechs with limited capital, high uncertainty. Portfolio strategy for them is also ultimately about focus, so they can indeed execute their brilliant science. But how should they decide which risks are worth concentrating on? Because you kind of took indeed the broad perspective. So curious on what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be absolutely more challenging biotechs that are very scientifically led. I think the lack of early commercial inputs, just because of the structure of the organization can be challenging. I mean, certainly here in our IDEA Pharma, we've produced methodologies that allow people to look at that risk investment reward profile across a range of different indications in a systematic fashion that's not too onerous. It's a cost-effective approach. And given, of course, the amounts involved, even in early clinical development, to pause for a relatively short period of time to do that kind of assessment and make those better decisions, it is absolutely doable for a biotech, even if they don't necessarily have full commercial function or regulatory or access function sitting within the organization. But I think the risk of not doing it is that again, they could make mistakes for an asset or across a range of assets. And a lot of biotechs may have platforms where they've focused on a particular target. They have several candidates, for example, moving forwards, and they may not just be a contingency, the second asset. There may be material differences about how those two things could be taken forward. It does matter. And particularly also because they're seeking funding, they may be looking to, sell up as well. Getting that framework of decisioning right is very important, because they're going to be speaking with investors and potential acquirers as well.
Yeah, great point regarding the commercial input early phase. So yeah, please continue.
Yeah, and I think the third thing, and this actually really starts to get into decision science, which is a discipline. Actually, it's a discipline not just in pharma but in other industries. But absolutely, how we make decisions and the structure that we put in place to allow that to happen. Who gets to make the decisions? What do they get to see to aid their decision making? When do we make those decisions? All of those things absolutely matter. The other thing, I think it's a typical thing in pharma, and I'm sure everybody listening to this has seen it on multiple occasions, there's a tendency to want to keep projects alive. And it's a very human thing to do as well. Obviously, some people's jobs may be dependent on keeping those assets alive as well. So there's a very natural thing of trying to do that. But what history tells us is that going forwards with wishful thinking, despite the evidence that we're not going to succeed, is not a helpful thing to do for a company. And particularly when we think about balancing investment risk and reward across a portfolio, for bigger companies, they've got multiple assets. The cost of development have gone up and up. Absolutely stopping at the right juncture is just as important as choosing the ones that we want to go forwards with. So it's absolutely a fundamental factor in portfolio decisioning is, do you have a good process for stopping projects as well as accelerating?
That's great. And I think that's also then how senior leaders ensure resources flow to few assets that really move the needle rather than being spread thinly across projects that, as you say, kind of perhaps not good enough to survive, or good enough to survive, but not good enough to win. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is a very interesting paper that was published not that long ago. And, that headline at the top about turkeys not voting for Christmas, this is actually a survey conducted amongst senior leaders in pharma, asking them about decision-making and some of the biases that they feel exist within their organizations. So back to that issue of, do you have a system in place? Who's making the decision? What's in front of them? There are a number of biases, and bear in mind, these are big companies. These are not, small organizations, that there are a number of things that are big factors. So the champion bias on the right-hand side, I think we all would recognize that there are some people maybe that are trusted more in an organization, but is that really an objective way of making the decisions? And then this confirmation bias that has popped up here as well. This absolutely is one of the biggest issues, that we tend to overweight evidence that we feel is positive and ignore stuff that's negative. So it's a classic thing also, if you've got marginally good data, and I spend a lot of my life looking at people's decision matrices in clinical development, there's a lot of stuff that ends up in the amber zone, not green, not red. When it's in the amber zone, the tendency is to really think it's sort of borderline green rather than saying, well, actually, it might very well be red. It's just a natural human tendency to do that.
Just to ask regarding the biases, because it sounds like it can quietly shape decisions, often without people realizing it. So where do you think bias shows up most dangerously in portfolio decisions, or what phase of development? And what are some of the things that you've seen to actually counteract it?
Yeah, so I think if you look at it, it's really the big transition points. And, for most pharmacology, that's between phase 2 and phase 3. So it's interpreting data from a phase 2 trial where obviously the scale, the duration, often the powering is going to be more limited than phase 3. In oncology, that's obviously earlier, typically in phase 1. But I'll give you a good example. I think, a lot of modern oncology is biomarker driven. If you don't build that in to some degree in your powering of your trials, there's lots of false positive risks in looking at data and then just continuing to subcut the data. You think you've got a positive signal in a particular subgroup with a biomarker, for example, you then move into later development and find that was a fallacious observation. So again, back to the early planning issue, if we have hypotheses like a biomarker-led approach, we've really got to build that in early. Absolutely, it can create problems with the scale of the trials. And if you're a biotech, it's, frustrating. You need more people if you're going to go hunting for biomarkers. But fishing trips in data absolutely up the risk quite substantially. So back to that wishful thinking thing, you could stare at 5 ORRs in a trial and draw a conclusion. We've got to be more rigorous in the stats, etc., to make the right decisions. And back to the early kill issue as well, or change of direction. We've got to have proper decision matrices in place that are based on science and statistics, not pejorative thinking as we go forward.
Yeah, no, great. And I do recognize that. And I also think that in addition to what you say, like really taking a scientific view or wanting to find certain signals, but also to consider what market companies are launching into and would it have clinically meaningful benefit, right? And make some judgment calls on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's right, that I've certainly seen assets with, relatively low criteria, if you like, to move to the next stage of development. I mean, there's great back history. If you look at the development and, talk about this, the AstraZeneca 5Rs framework for decision making, that was really born out of a period where there were quite a few assets put into late stage clinical development that had relatively marginal benefit profiles in phase 2. In other words, you're lowering the hurdle in your decision matrix for moving forwards.
Yeah.
And of course, ultimately that, is going to drive clinical risk. Phase 3 results tend to be worse than phase 2. There's a dilutional effect. And then, as you rightly say, is this a drug with clinically meaningful benefits that, will bring benefits to patients that people will pay for at the other end? We're effectively setting ourselves up for clinical and commercial risk and even failure as a result of doing that.
Exactly. And also many organizations still anchor decisions heavily on metrics like NPV, which I know you are also will be expanding on. So based on your work, where does this approach fall short?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting slide, actually. I mean, I'll talk a bit about NPV later as well. I think that there are, even with good risk-adjusted NPVs, there, absolutely can be issues because it's encompassing two metrics effectively. One is risk and one is reward. And there are different ways you can get to the same number, and that can be an issue. I mean, I think if you look at the left-hand side here, I think, it's very familiar to most people that some areas are innately more difficult to get assets through. We do a lot of work at IDEA in oncology and neuroscience. They're actually sadly at the bottom of the scale in terms of, they're higher risk in general. I will say, though, that the problem with a lot of these numbers is that, they're averaging out across a broad range of assets in different disease states within a particular therapy area. And they don't, of course, provide a very accurate guide at all to an individual molecule and its chance of success. And we'll come and talk about probability of technical success later. But they provide a general steer. And if you're the CEO of a company, you've got multiple therapeutic areas, it's obviously clear to you that there are some areas that are intrinsically going to be higher risk for you to conduct. I think the thing on the right-hand side is perhaps less well understood, that going into a therapy area for a company that's not done it before is innately going to be higher risk. There's a brain trust within any organization, and the longer they've been in an area, the higher their chances of being successful are. And this is a model on the right-hand side, so I wouldn't want to put too much store by the exact numbers, but it does remind us that you need good experience to get all of those decisions right. And if you're building an organization, it may be harder because the brain trust just isn't there, the experience isn't there. And you look at companies that are very seasoned, where they've also brought in external expertise from academia to help them make better decisions. They've ended up being more successful as a result of that.
Interesting. And on one side, not surprising, but good for leaders to be aware of and have the data.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, what really is decision intelligence? And we think about decision intelligence at IDEA Pharma. That's a phrase that we use. And, you highlighted this earlier, Jackie, about, what we mean by execution. And absolutely, there can be executional issues. So, in preparation for launch and how that's conducted, we typically focus a lot around that. I think, have we got the right molecule and do we execute? But actually, a lot of the decisions on the way through are absolutely what's driving chances of success and failure. And I don't just mean does it get through or not. I mean commercial success as well as clinical and regulatory success as well. So that classic funnel that we've all seen, really what we are asking is, can we move the needle so that when we've got assets that are coming through in early clinical development, we're upping their chances of getting through to the other end of development and then doing a good job after they've been launched. So if you think on average, 1 in 20 of phase 1 assets will hit launch, and then a lot of the ones that hit launch don't even make their development money back, how can we move those increments? There's no point us pretending we're going to get from 1 in 20 to 1 in 5, that would be very over ambitious. But actually, it doesn't take much change in that ratio for the business model in pharma to really change significantly. And that's what decision intelligence really is all about. And it's a process of these 3 things. So analytical rigor, and we've already touched on that. We need good data. We need good models to aid us. None of these things are ever going to be 100% accurately predictive, but the more accurate they are, the better we will do. The piece in the middle we've already alluded to. Do we understand how we make those decisions and those behavioral issues that we've already described? Do we put systems in place that mitigate against those biases? We mentioned politics here, all these other things that can get in the way of making objective decisions. And then finally, that piece at the bottom, which may sound, perfunctory, but actually who attends the meetings? When do they happen? What's in front of them? Who ultimately makes the decisions? Is it collective? Is it individual? Absolutely, there's evidence from pharma and other industries that those things can matter. So it's very important that all of these pieces are in place in a way that is more objective to allow us to make better decisions on the way through.
Yes, I guess this is sometimes also referred to decision-making power by the highest paid person in the room. But as you started also your presentation, it also really comes down to cross-functional input and bringing those assumptions and optionality to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a conversation I had with the CMO of a very large pharma company who then moved on into biotech. And in the discussion, he just said, I never assumed I was the smartest person in the room. I was absolutely reliant on the team to bring me the kind of information and discussion that we needed to make the right decision. And that showed a degree of humility that I think is important. I think that's a very pyramidal approach of saying that, in this case, the CMO holds the wisdom, has been shown time and time again to fail. That's not because there aren't great individuals, but great individuals can also make bad decisions.
Yep.
And actually, I think this is a great segue into the Lilly story. Lilly have obviously been highly successful in the last decade or so. And I love this quote from Dan because, this really hits the nail on the head. We're not in the business of hope, we're in the business of evidence. And actually, that a very objective framework that they put in place from, quite a lot of years back has made a very big difference to them. And I'll come on and talk a bit later about some of the other facets of their portfolio approach, because it's not the only thing they do actually that has propelled them forwards. But again, that quote in the bottom right-hand side, it's admitting when we're wrong, being very objective about killing as well as advancing. Those things have made a massive difference. So improving your chances of mid and late phase success by accelerating the right projects and killing the ones with lower chances of success. But then, of course, looking across the portfolio and saying, we've got a certain amount of money effectively to throw at development. How do we best leverage that capital across these assets, and being very rigorous in how they choose to do it? So it's going from that asset decisioning up the chain into the portfolio decisioning, and how you balance again investment risk and reward across that. They've got an absolutely rock solid process for doing that clearly has borne fruit for them as an organization.
Yeah, and indeed a great example. And also, as you know, in our 2026 Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index, Lilly this year was recognized for both number 1 invention and innovation. And it's great that we've started to also discuss the human aspect in terms of decision intelligence for pharma. And besides what you say, kind of the approach that you've heard from the CMO and what's here from Dan from Eli Lilly, is there anything else that pharma leaders and executives should do in terms of the culture they build or the organization they structure?
No, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things actually that is very important, I think, is, that there's a risk of people believing that an asset failing is somehow a reflection of the team. There's a very human thing there, isn't there? It's we have failed the asset as well as perhaps the asset failing us. And actually, the culture needs to reward decisions in stopping projects as much as it does in advancing them, because in the risky, highly expensive world in which we live in drug development, killing stuff and making those decisions when they're right can be just as important as the advancement for the overall success of the organization. So calling out, the emperor's new clothes moment of, I don't think this is right, we should stop because, or we should change direction because, needs to be rewarded more. And I think that's something that not all organizations are necessarily very good at.
Great point. And also something I've heard from another top performing company in our index, AstraZeneca. Suzanne Gilbreth, the Vice President R&D of Oncology, shared a similar example. Yeah, so great. Let's continue.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I don't want to get too far into, all of the science, if you like, behind decision making, but this is a classic thing that everybody's familiar with statistics will be aware of. Alpha is obviously claiming a data relationship that isn't there. You talked about that earlier, the tendency to overrate the data, but obviously the alpha in any statistical testing is built around making that decision. Beta is the inverse, clearly claiming a data relationship that isn't there. But it's, there are other sources of error in here that can occur in strategic decision making. Have we got the wrong problem in front of us? Do we have adequate alternatives? I mean, what could we have done instead of this? And I think, by the way, it's a very interesting question. I think there are a lot of decision-making groups within pharma that are still looking at what's in front of them immediately. So the team brings in approach and decision-making criteria and then saying, well, we need to make a decision. The clock is ticking. Actually, a pause may be appropriate if there's something else that's going to be brought in that's similar within the portfolio. So actually, timing can matter as well. I mean, maybe there's a better alternative waiting around the corner, and if only we thought about it, we would have made a different decision. But time pressure in pharma is obviously a very big issue, and that can also lead to aberrant decision making. Not acting when you should, acting when you shouldn't. I mean, these are other things. And then, of course, the interaction of errors. And actually, it's very interesting when you look at that. So you think of cumulative over positivity about, not just chance of clinical success, but the commercial success. Oh, we have a bit of a regulatory issue, but we'll handle that when we get there. I mean, that's the interaction of all of those areas. In fact, the risk profile has gone up substantially, but we haven't perceived that. And these things are multipliers, aren't they? Right? They're not even additive. They can multiply the risk substantially if we've underestimated the individual risks that exist in those different areas that we've discussed. And this is one of my favorite things. I think most people probably don't read stats journals. It's not everybody's starting point, but I'll just draw your attention actually to the authors at the bottom, Bob Beckman and Con Chen, who were two of the statisticians behind Keytruda at Merck, which is one of the best case studies in our industry of, obviously hugely successful drug that's brought benefit to many oncology patients. But they quite rightly, very early, as you can see, 15 years ago, called out what they call type 3 error, which is the opportunity cost of not doing something. If you didn't test it, you'd never know the answer to the question. And that's a very interesting thing that we often don't think about. We worry about the chances of success and failure, so type 1 alpha and type 2 beta error in our decision making. But what if we left something on the table that if we'd done it could have propelled us forward? And actually, Keytruda is a great example of the drug where they did a multiplicity of experiments in early clinical phase. Because the translational science in immuno-oncology was tough, it still is tough, not easy to predict where a PD-1 would have worked across this wide range of tumor types. But they realized quite early on that if they didn't go and test, they'd never know the answer. And there's some great quotes from senior leadership around how they'd accelerated broadly in phase 1 and phase 2 development, because their big fear was that they would miss opportunities of how they could improve patient outcomes if they didn't go and conduct those experiments. So when we get to portfolio decision making and how it can be done, so trying to bring together all of those factors, including actually the translational piece across the boundary from preclinical into clinical, I think this in many ways is the poster child of this kind of approach that was really born out of quite a dark period at AstraZeneca, where a lot of drugs failed in late development which obviously is a hugely expensive point to fail, where the companies was very much on the back foot. I'm sure everybody remembers that there was potentially an imminent takeover by Pfizer at that time. Clearly, the company has turned itself around massively, and it's done very well, Jackie, hasn't it, again, in the PIII this year in 2026. But this framework that was put in place, the 5Rs framework, was, one of the critical drivers. And you can see on the left-hand side here that some of these factors absolutely go back into the preclinical and then translational science, where they perceived they had issues. But then as we get into the clinical development piece of the right patient, have we got the right target for our asset, whether it's biomarker or phenotypic segmentation? Absolutely critical. And they had lots of failures into phase 3 before they put 5R in place, where the populations they went at were too broad and the effect really was in a narrow population, and their competitors accelerated away from them by doing different experiments. And then critically, as I go back to our first line about risk, the right commercial potential, do we really understand the market we're launching into, the competitors? Have we personalized, as it says here, so we've really found our segment within the market to go and operate within? And you can see on the right-hand side the follow-through from that there absolutely were changes post-2010. You can then see from 12 to 16 that they've outlined what happened next as a result of pushing in these more rigorous portfolio decision-making frameworks.
Great case study. And also building on what you mentioned regarding the strategic errors, but also the timing of decision making. Quite often, at least something that I've come across, is that leadership teams might say, well, we'll wait until we have the data before they also start considering other inputs needed to make a good decision at these crucial inflection points. So what would you say to those leaders who feel like we wait and then we start to think what else we might need to consider? And also often here, the commercial exit aspect might not be considered, or the competitive space not fully, in terms of what would be, an uplift in the standard of care. Because it's indeed great to have these frameworks, but then if the organization is still in a wait and see mode, it might not be helpful. So what does AstraZeneca, for instance, do different there?
Yeah, no, again, it's a great question. I think that if you think of those tollgate decisions, I mean, that's what we're talking about, is, when we're accruing data, where do we go from where we are? And of course, it could be a straightforward yes, no. Often it's more complex. It's a yes, but, in this population or, segment, those aren't just clinical decisions. They have regulatory import. They have clearly commercial import as well. And people often talk about clinical decision matrices. Certainly our thinking at IDEA Pharma is what I call a clinical commercial decision matrix. In other words, building in the commercial piece as part of that. So, for example, setting targets that are realistic, not just for clinical science, but will this produce an asset at the other end that the world would be interested in utilizing? Could it beat the competition? Certainly, can it well beat standard of care that already exists? Of course, at the point of decisioning, if you don't have that information available to you, you're then going to have to wait. And, time is absolutely an issue. To us, it makes a lot more sense to have done that working out, be clear about your go, no go criteria. We all know that there's going to be a bit of an orange zone in the middle, but don't have most of your decision matrix as orange. That's setting you up for the wishful thinking of pushing it to green when it's probably red. And that matrix needs to account for all of the facets of risk that we described earlier. Of course, there's always going to be areas of uncertainty. We all understand that. But I think a lot of the big decisions, you can be preemptive in that regard and say, look, this is what we need to move forward. And it could be an A, B, and a C. There could be 3 cases of what you could move forwards with, for example. But if you've outlined all of that, you're clear about that, you will make better decisions, and you will less likely to say, we'll just tip it over the edge if you haven't met the criteria.
Yeah, preparation and also alignment indeed on the go, no go criteria, as you say.
Yeah,
Right.
Absolutely. So, I was going to talk about some other decision frameworks that are in place. I mean, these are 3 great examples that you can see up here, and I'll go through them one by one, beyond the 5Rs piece. And I'll finish with Lily and talk a little bit more, because there's a bit more complexity than we showed you on the slides with the quotes earlier. So Roche and Intech have this process they call RAVE, risk alignment, value executability, and use this ratings approach. You can see they've got 1 to 9 ratings and really rank what's coming forwards. Now, of course, if things are coming forward at the same time, that allows more of a compare and contrast. If they're coming forward separately, that doesn't preclude doing this. But you can see that this idea of rave days, nothing to do with, going to a dance festival. This is really being very objective of bringing these ratings forward for these assets and saying, look, do they meet the criteria that the business is setting out? So, that transparency around the kill zone, I think, is really important. We've talked about that earlier. Of course, there can be a tendency for people to try and sort of edge things away from the kill zone. But I think that doing this as objectively as possible gets away from that. What you can also see is that, again, it's got that multiplicity of factors in it: risk, alignment, value, executability. So, the commercial piece around value is absolutely built in. Does it align with portfolio strategy? What are the risks? And then the executability thing, I think people often forget. Can we make this happen in late phase clinical development? Do we have the biomarker we need? Can that biomarker be executed in the real world, for example? Do we have a supply chain issue? All of those other things that are going to matter. We've seen that time and time again in cancer with CAR-T, for example. A big issue in the business model was the ability to execute and turn around the product, not the science itself. So if you've modeled all of that out, you can make better decisions. And equally, you can also find areas like that supply chain issue and say, how can we mitigate the risk? We're X years from launch. What do we need to put in place to change that paradigm? So you can see that tech commercial space as well. Science first, then market overlay makes great sense. If the science is not going to work, that's your red flag. Doesn't matter really what the commercial model looks like. So sequencing it to some extent like that is doable. Actually, our predilection is to do it in the round at the same point, but different systems have different ups and downs to them, and that sort of scorecard ritualistic thing, as you can see, it's very much an objective set of measures to make those decisions. So how does that work in practice? These are the more specific criteria. I won't go into them in great detail. In fact, they haven't published them, so we can't actually look under the hood. But as I say, it's across a range of all of these different facets, and I think that's absolutely critical, and that they all matter. You can't over-index in one and win. You have to be able to demonstrate that you've solved across this range of RAVE criteria to move forward. So moving on to Pfizer, different acronym, decision integrity and continuous evaluation. Actually, I think that's something that's very interesting. I'll focus in on this one. In some ways, this is not wildly dissimilar from what we can see from the way that Roche do it. I think there's just more of a continuous pressure testing as they go forwards in development. It's not just toll gate. There are other points within the development cycle other than data availability that could drive different decisioning. And it's interesting that they start with more of an assumption of failure, which unfortunately is the truth in our business. Most stuff fails. And then certainly looking historic analogues in a lot of detail. I think getting under the skin of, do you remember those numbers I showed earlier where we say, oh, look, on average, it's 20% Yeah, but that's only an average. There's a range around that within a therapy area. Do we have other indicators on this particular project that means it's more at the, the higher or the lower end of that risk range within a particular therapeutic space? And they're honestly good predictors. I'll come to that later. That have been shown on average to drive things to the higher and the lower end. So for an individual project, you can make different decisions. You don't just have to look at the average. So that log everything, pre-mortem everything, and really store the data and the outcomes so that you're building your own in-house view of what's driving success and failure. Absolutely, it's very useful. I'll go back to AstraZeneca. I know that they've done a huge job with AI now, with data lakes, trying to cross-reference preclinical and clinical work to help with their translational work. So they're really trying to analyze their own in-house data sets extensively again to try and look at those predictors individual predictors of success and failure of approaches. And I think that that's definitely the way forward.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we do know. So we don't know all of the details about exactly how Pfizer do this, but what we do know is since they put this in place, as you can see, their metrics have improved. Whether that's, a self-fulfilling prophecy or not, it's difficult to know. But if you take it on face value, those three pillars absolutely have driven a cumulatively better approach over time, as you can see from the mid-2010s into the start of this decade.
Very interesting.
And then finally, we talked about Eli Lilly. They've actually got a number of things that they've put in place to do this. So I talked quite a lot about their sort of kill criteria and being very analytic. Actually, I'll go back to something that they did earlier, this approach called Chorus as well, which is they separated out the group who were doing that early phase work and sort of empowered them to make decisions. That's had a very significant impact again. It's a very science-led approach at the front end about accelerating versus killing. And they more recently have started to use AI modeling to help with their decision-making. And where it says overrides enthusiasm, again, this is back to being very rational and data-led in their approach to how they make the decisions. And Chorus is actually very interesting. So it's this independent, specialized clinical development unit, as I say. And actually, this is again a reminder that one of the problems of these companies can be scale, that we put in lots of constructs and decision-making paradigms. There's lots of people involved. It can be slow. The assumption, of course, is we're making better decisions with those frameworks. But, go back to a biotech, smaller, leaner, making sure that was built into their model, despite their scale, was a drive behind Chorus. And actually, it's been very successful for them just to empower that early development engine to make those decisions and get away from some of the big complex structures that hindered some of the other organizations. And then I'm not an expert in MILP at all, using AI, using the best tech we can to try and make decisions. And I'll talk a bit about that later as well. But they've partnered with NVIDIA to do this. Actually, it's very interesting that Roche, a couple of weeks later, then said, we've actually got the most powerful supercomputer. We've sort of usurped Lilly. I don't know how you judge power in supercomputers. It's not my area. But it's very clear that we've now got different tools we can bring to bear to help make these decisions. And actually, machine learning to understand drivers of success and failure, I think, is starting to become instructive. And we'll see more of that as we go forwards. I don't personally believe it's going to take us, back from our 1 in 20 to would we get to 1 in 5? I don't think that's the point. But if it goes from 1 in 20 to 1 in 18 or 15, that's a big shift already. If you work that through, one more successful asset, Jackie, can make a huge difference to somebody's portfolio.
No, definitely. And one of the things that we also see across the top performing companies in the Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index is that they apply AI solutions and digital solutions strategically and really integrate it with, you could say, clear use cases. And companies that are less effective, they take a more opportunistic approach and have one-off pilots. Often it starts with the pilots, but then obviously it's about across a large organization, how do you ensure that it's scaled and consistent implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing Lilly have been exceptional at as well is that this approach isn't just about saying, should I move this asset forward or not? I mean, obviously that's very useful. Back to our portfolio rather than individual asset focus here. What their system allows them to do is to redistribute resource within the organization towards projects that they believe have got a higher chance of success. And that dynamism in saying, we're going to stop that one or downscale it. How can we rapidly redeploy resource? And I don't just mean money, but people, expertise into higher value and higher likelihood of success projects is really critical. We've all seen this in organizations that, yes, when projects die, people get redeployed, but actually the speed of that, the intensity of that can really matter. And again, that sort of agility that they've brought in here is another factor in why they've ended up at the top of our PII. to better decision making. And actually then that's led to better execution at a portfolio level in that agility that I described.
Right.
Very good. So, just some conclusions here. I mean, decision framework should absolutely encompass the range of parameters that are going to be important. It can't just be that translational clinical if we don't build in that broader view, commercial access, regulatory, we're missing red flags, all of the systems we've just outlined that these big organizations are now employing absolutely consider across the range of those risks. NPV in itself can be misleading, particularly, the risk-adjusted approach, because you can get to the same number from, different combinations of risk and reward. Our view, idea is you should separate those two things out. That gives you a more detailed understanding of the risk and reward profiles from different approaches that you may take with an asset, or indeed for an individual asset itself. Got to have dispassionate systems. You need pre-mortems. Got to have good boundaries, don't fudge it. Too much of the orange zone is definitely a problem. And then, AI, I mean, it's a broad term, but, machine learning particularly is aiding our ability to move that needle, as I've said, and don't believe it's going to suddenly shift it massively, but it will do incrementally over time. And that is going to have an important impact on success and failure in any portfolio.
Thank you. And I know we're already tracking towards the end of our episode. And one of the things that I think taking away from your presentation and experiences also with all these different models and decision frameworks also applied by industry, there's really no shortage of tools. But you also argue that decision quality is important, not just the prediction accuracy. So how do you design that into a decision-making process and impact client portfolio outcomes? And I know you have some more thoughts or considerations to share with our listeners as well on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, as you say, the detail of how you do this matters. One of the things I'm very interested in, if you're running one of these big companies, you're not going to put all this in the public domain, I'm sure, but part of putting these systems in place, and I mean, it's true for 5R, it's true for RAVE, any of these pieces, is that you can then feed your outcomes back into your system and audit it and understand whether the criteria you set out are working or not. So it's very easy to say, for example, I'm going to have these buckets of things and I'm going to look at and I'm going to make my decisions on. How do you know whether you're right or not? Ultimately, well, you've got to audit this and you may very well change your criteria over time. So again, there's a risk of being rigid and saying, we've got these criteria and that's what we apply. I would absolutely believe we're going to change some of these over time as we learn that some things are bigger or smaller drivers of success and outcome. And that's definitely the truism and the probability of technical success area, which is what I was going to talk about next, and just go and move into that and just outline that, because I think this is one of the critical inputs into any of these decision matrices that we undertake, any of these systems that we're putting in place. And I think it's an area that has been fraught with difficulty for a long period of time. I think back to the averages just won't cut it. Can we get better at predicting which things are more likely to succeed and fail, so that when we're making those decisions, we have a good assessment in front of us? I mean, back to that question we had earlier, that if you're running a large company with multiple different therapeutic areas, they are going to have different levels of risk. And part of what you've taken on in running your company is that you accept that. There are examples of companies that have decided to divest. I mean, Roche did from neuroscience for some years, for example, because they just believed the risks were too high. But barring that, you're going to accept that you're going to get less things through in neuroscience than you might in cardiovascular, because there's a truism in that. But within each of those areas, how can you make better decisions about picking the winners, the likely winners for you in an organization, at least at a technical level? So this, of course, absolutely matters. And that if you go back to AstraZeneca and its 5Rs, a lot of that stuff was about modeling technical risk. And you can see on this slide, we worked on this 3 large phase 3 trials called Connex for Boehringer Ingelheim. This is all in the public domain. They've been very good at publishing the well highlighted failure of these 3 clinical trials. and understanding the things that underpin this, a lot of which actually were operational issues, very difficult to run cognitive impairment trials within schizophrenia. But, there's something that's very important here when people look at probability of technical success. You're including things at a disease level, the construct of the disease, operational issues in the trials, as well as whether you think the pharmacology is going to work. All of those things are part of what imbues risk in clinical development. And if you don't separate those things out, you're just mixing up all of these different drivers of risk. And you're also not understanding where you may be able to ameliorate those risks. So given that we're given some pharmacology, and yes, we can manipulate dose, for example, but fundamentally we can't really change that. All of those other things are going to be what's going to drive our chances of success and failure in clinical development. And they are manipulable. Who we put it into, for how long, what outcome measures we use, what biomarkers we use, what comparator, all of those things are things that we can consider. And then also at an operational level, there are things that we can change about how we run the trials. And it's a sad fact that a very substantial proportion of mid and late phase clinical trials fail for operational issues. They're nothing to do with the pharmacology of the asset. And we talked a bit about NPV earlier. Whatever metrics you use for outcome, this is a great paper by a chap called Jack Scannell, who was an analyst. He's now a CEO of a biotech, where he looked back at that. How much does it take to move the needle if we just got a bit better at our predictability for the chance of success in our trials and what impact it has on NPV? And I won't bore you with these curves, but marginal gains in positive predictive value, are almost as useful as you can see here in manipulating other factors we consider critical for success. So I think it's just a salutary reminder when I go back to how much do we have to change our probability of technical success accuracy. It's not very much actually to really make an impact on our decision making and the business model that sits next to that. So, you can run Monte Carlo simulations endlessly, by the way, on phase 2 data. This is a classic thing pharma companies do. They say, this is what we found. This is the delta we found between active and comparative in our trial. You model it and then say, okay, great. This is the chances of success when we scale that up to a phase 3. The problem with that is that it doesn't account for all those other drivers of the probability of technical success I've just outlined. So yes, it has value, but it can be very misleading. And they're great examples of where companies have moved forward saying the chances of success were good. The reality is that they didn't account for all those other things. And actually Connex is an example of that. The operational stuff was a very big overriding issue that wasn't really necessarily accounted for in that decision making. Lots of models out there. This is the one that Novartis published some years ago. You can go and look at it. The maths has been published. So we've used this. We've taken that maths and moved it forwards. I think very interesting that it's a mixture of hard analytic, if you like, but then there are other pieces in here. So it does use what you could call subjective experience-led viewpoints. You could argue that's back to our issue of putting human error and risk in. I would argue the inverse, that because none of these models actually are very accurate, they can't be for lots of reasons, that it's not unreasonable to have an overlay of cumulative experience in an organization. I think as AI gets better, machine learning gets better, we put in more variables and understand drivers of risk, we may be able to get rid of some of that subjective adjustment. But at this stage, it's actually very hard. None of the even AI models, and I'll show you that in a second, has necessarily been able to kill the use of some of that more subjective decision making. And this indeed is an overview of lots of these models that have been conducted. And again, I won't bore you with these, but we are making incremental gains in the area under the curve, which is a measure of how good we are at predicting what happens next. And as I say, as we advance and put more variables in, have better models, we are going to get better at that. Just do bear in mind when you look at this, though, that you're much more likely to succeed the further you go across phases anyway. PTS for phase 3 is always better than it is for phase 1 and phase 2, because we've already removed some of the risks by, going through our development cycle. But nevertheless, we are getting better at doing this, and we'll continue to do it. But why is it not that accurate ultimately, even with good AI? The answer is because there's lots and lots of variables that may derail you as you go forwards. This is an example of an antipsychotic in schizophrenia, and really dissecting out why one may have succeeded and another may have failed. All of these populations are on the bottom here. That the exact nature of the population probably drove the chances of success. Ultimately, these are very difficult things to necessarily preemptively predict. So again, let's be clear, none of these systems are going to be able to pick winners. That's a fantasy. They're just going to help us to narrow down some of the risks. And we said earlier, set risk boundaries and stick to them. This is a model from about 10 years ago. Again, the details don't really matter, but being really clear about those green, orange, and red zones, what's going to drive us to say yes or no, and do it in advance. If you fudge it afterwards, you're much more likely to move things forward with human positivity than really, as was, we highlighted earlier from Lilly, just being clear when we say no, we mean no. We must stop because the evidence is telling us that. So just some, brief, quick conclusions about PTS. Simulation trial results alone is flawed because it doesn't account for all of the drivers of probability of technical success at different stages in clinical development. As a single measure, it's flawed. You need to really look at those generic drivers of outcome within a particular area, like neuroscience, for example, but then asset and population-specific drivers. So, for example, including a biomarker ups your chances of PTS. There are more specific things you can look at that will aid your decisioning about whether this is more or less likely to succeed, well worth looking at. It is of value for portfolio balancing, and at a particular point in the history of a company saying, do we want to take that level of risk, or are we comfortable with a lower level of risk? If cash is at a premium at a particular point, yes, it is useful for that. But, don't believe that it's some kind of fixed miracle number. The difference between 60 and 65 on PTS is an illusion. These are very similar numbers. It's really the bigger differences that we're looking for. And then finally, we're learning out of machine learning, how to get better at doing this. But are we ever going to be able to put in all the variables that will drive a better understanding? It's going to be incremental gain. Don't believe that we're suddenly going to get to really saying, is this going to succeed or fail? That level of accuracy is illusional. But nevertheless, it's an important factor in our decision making.
Amazing, Alex. And thank you also, I would say, on behalf of our audience, who obviously for them, this is a day-to-day reality. But you've done so much work in terms of reviewing the decision frameworks, looking at case studies. And I know a lot of that comes also from the work we do with clients. And yeah, listening to all of this, it's of such great strategic importance that I also think it's, amazing that we get to work with these teams in the industry and move molecules and ultimately products forward. So just wrapping up here, and if you kind of zoom out and think about, indeed, you've kind of talked through what does good look like in terms of decision intelligence, decision making, and how can organizations design such a process. But if you think ahead, and you mentioned AI, but also if we want to improve the statistics of drugs making it to market, what are really capabilities or behaviors that will define that next generation of high-performing pharma portfolios?
No, it's a great question. I think it goes back to a number of the things that we said. I think that because success, and success for our patients, drives commercial success for these, looking at it in the round across those range of disciplines is critical. All of the evidence from these big companies who put these systems in place, they're not just looking at, technical risk and clinical risk. They're looking right across the board, doing it early enough that you've really considered, across that range of disciplines. I think that's absolutely critical. And having that information available at the point where you're making decisions around individual assets as they traverse the development cycle. optionality matters a huge amount. I think we forget that, minor changes in the way that you're going to take the asset forward could make a big difference in whether it gets there or not, or how well it will perform at the other end. So in essence, we're not really weighing up whether we should take the asset forward. We're asking the question of where could we take it forwards and how do we take it forwards to maximize its chances of technical, regulatory, commercial success at the other end. And we're great fans here at IDEA of doing exactly that. Look at a range of things you could do and then actively dismiss options to allow you to focus on the ones where you've got the best chance of performance. I think that's absolutely critical. And then put in that kind of decision-making process systematically within your organization across silos. The typical thing in pharma is you've got, different groups of people working in silos. This works across, it's a horizontal process across those disciplines. That's absolutely, those are clear drivers of success in these organizations. Do it at multiple points within the development cycle and have very clear guidance about what success and failure looks like. All of those things are very clearly at an evidence level being shown to drive a better chance of success, of getting through and being successful for patients and ultimately for the company.
Great. So with that, I think we're wrapping up our episode here. And I think one of the things I can add to, you could say, building next generation successful portfolios also comes from our Pharmaceutical Innovation and Invention Index, the longest running benchmark in the industry is, and I know it's been used a lot, but is really also agility that the leaders need to have, with obviously also zooming out of the organization and with the geopolitical changes, the regulatory affairs landscape that is changing. It's not just, you could say, the path to market and then also having all of this complexity, but also a more politicized path to market that needs to be considered. And companies that do well, as you say, both focus on great science, but also execution, and executing across regions has become more important, especially with China changing the global landscape in terms of pharmaceutical drug development. And the top performing companies do also have strategic approaches for finding innovation there, but also launching their product. So I think we could easily continue for another hour, but I would say to our listeners, feel free to get in touch with Alex or me. We're happy to further deep dive on product or portfolio strategies and share our insights and learnings. Alex, anything else you would want to say to our listeners?
Well, come and talk to us. We've looked at this a lot, and we'll be delighted to help you with these challenges.
Great. Thank you so much.